Plato's Cave. I'm Jordan Myers, and today we're going to take another step towards exiting the cave by speaking with the philosopher Derek Leben. Derek is an associate professor of philosophy and the department chair at the University of Pittsburgh-Johnstown. Derek was kind enough to come on the podcast today to talk about a recent article of his in Philosophy Now called Pascal's Artificial Intelligence Wager. We talked about artificial intelligence and Pascal's wager, as you can gather from that title. But then the conversation sprawled to other related but very interesting things. It was a very fun talk. Really appreciate Derek coming on to speak with me. So without further preamble, here is my talk with Derek Leben. Because I emailed you about that nice short piece in Philosophy Now, which is a great online publication and in print, I would assume too.
Yeah.
Okay. Called Pascal's Artificial Intelligence Wager. I know that it was at least available in August, I think, because that's when I emailed you. You published that in 2020? That's right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a very short kind of look into the risks of general AI, which is, obviously a topic that is more and more relevant. But so I'm curious how you conceive of what AI is, because my rather lay notion of it is just that, artificial intelligence would be the ability. So I guess, and we'll get into this, but I guess I would leave consciousness out of the definition. So AI would not have to be conscious, but it has to be able to compute, and in maybe loose terms, think in roughly the same ways that we tend to. Do you agree with that?
The term artificial intelligence doesn't really have a well worked out, agreed upon definition. Generally speaking, it means any kind of machine that performs tasks like a human does. More and more in the 21st century, it's meant models that are trained using some kind of machine learning procedure. But machine learning is just one part of AI. It's not the only part of AI. And there are, of course, machines that do some things very narrowly like a human can do. That's sometimes called narrow AI. So for instance, a machine that drives a car by itself, a machine that determines someone's credit score by itself, a machine that, for instance, also recognizes images or faces or produces speech and language. These are all narrow AI systems because they do the kinds of things that humans do. But general AI is something which is supposed to do everything that humans do, and maybe more. And again, there's no well agreed upon definition of what this means, but when people talk about general AI, they usually mean something that does everything a human can do, that can play chess and drive a car and recognize images and use language. It can carry over its knowledge from one domain into other domains. And so I usually, in my own research, focus on narrow AI and the risks and benefits of narrow AI. But I'm also, just as a philosopher and a human, interested in general AI. This is something that is probably going to happen at some point. There are some fun polls that have been done of the computer science community about what people expect or when people expect general AI to actually happen. But at some point in the future, it is likely to happen. And that's what I am writing about in this article is what should our feelings be about this kind of thing? Should we be very worried about it or not very worried about it?
Mm-hmm. And I guess the other crucial piece is that artificial intelligence, when it becomes generalized, doesn't really require us anymore as an input to continue running. And that's where the promise and the danger lies, right?
Yeah, so narrow AI might also satisfy that. So narrow AI doesn't need a human to drive a car. It can drive on its own. It might not be able to do it well for very long. A Tesla on autopilot can drive on its own without any human input. So that is, in some sense, an AI, and that's an important part of what people usually have in mind when they talk about AI, is that it's pretty free from human supervision, free from human intervention, that it can act autonomously. Autonomous is an important word in the history of philosophy, and it just means making rules for yourself, not doing what other people tell you to do, but making up your own mind. And so that is a big part of AI systems, is that they can act with minimal human intervention.
You opened the piece. I like the way you opened it, and it made me, kind of cynically laugh because, you talk about in 2008, the physicists doing an experiment at CERN where some people predicted, it's very unlikely, but no one declared it was impossible for this actually to just open up a black hole and destroy, literally everyone on the planet, and including the planet. It made me also think of the Trinity test in 1945, how... Yeah, it was J. Robert Oppenheimer's quote, "I'm become death, the destroyer of worlds." Like people literally did not know. There was some non-zero chance that it ignited the atmosphere.
Right.
And they just did it anyway. Like, we show absolutely no ability to not do something if we have the ability to do it. And you link that to, is it possible that we are rolling the dice in some non-zero way with AI in this same sense?
Yeah, so the field of existential threat assessment is a really interesting and weird field. It's one that is not necessarily connected to AI, but in the last 15 years or so, there's been a lot of discussion about the overlap there. Existential threats to humanity are the kinds of things that you might think of as, let's just include nuclear weapons, or superbugs, maybe climate change, depending on how severe that winds up being, asteroid impacts, large-scale asteroids, and so how should we think about these threats, these events? And the weird thing about them is that they involve what you might think of as sort of infinite losses. This is something that one of the original inventors of expected utility theory and decision theory, Blaise Pascal, originally proposed. And it's funny to me that as soon as there became a formal mathematical framework for thinking about risks and threats and rewards, Pascal immediately applied it to talking about infinite rewards and God. That didn't have to be the case. But just in everyday life, every time you get into a car, you're taking some risk with your own life. Every time you eat some food, you're taking a risk that you could choke. And so everything we do in our everyday life involves some risk, some danger. And usually the way we evaluate those risks are we estimate how likely this is going to be and how bad it would be if it happened. So non-lethal risks, such as, for instance, just losing some money. If I play the lottery, I might estimate, okay, well, how likely am I to win? How much is the jackpot? And there's an easy formula to do where you just multiply the likelihood of winning by the payoff that you get, and then you compare that to the cost of the ticket. And if the likelihood times the payoff is more than the cost of the ticket, then expected value theory says you should buy that. If it's less, then expected value theory says you shouldn't buy it. And almost always, lottery games are rigged so that the expected value of winning is like half what it is the cost of the price of playing. So that is how we evaluate risks in everyday life. But existential threats are weird, especially existential threats to the entire future of humanity, because it's not obvious how to evaluate an infinite loss or an infinite gain. When you multiply the probability of some very bad thing happening, or I'm sorry, the probability times the payoff of something very bad, or the probability times the payoff of something very good, you get some number. And you can do calculations with these numbers. But when you multiply the probability of something times infinity, then you get these weird results. And so we can go a lot of directions here, but I don't know if you wanted to first talk about existential threats like asteroids and superbugs, or if you wanted to talk about Pascal's wager.
I was thinking Pascal's wager because it really is an interesting way to think about this specifically, because the concept, I don't know, did you come up with this term, the anti-natalism about artificial general intelligence? I liked that.
I did, yeah. I actually thought it was funny that the same kinds of arguments that people are giving for not creating AI are similar to the kinds of arguments that people give for not creating new humans. Anti-natalism is a surprisingly popular position, or at least it's been growing in its popularity over the last 5 or 10 years. Especially in message forums online. David Benatar, this South African philosopher, is the most famous advocate of this position. And it basically says that we shouldn't create new humans because the suffering we create is more than the happiness we create, or the dangers we introduce by having children are greater than the potential rewards that we would reap. I thought that was just a cute little jab. It wasn't really part of my argument. I just thought that was a funny analogy to make.
Yeah. So wouldn't the two views, sort of anti-natalism about humans and anti-natalism about artificial intelligence, differ in how, I guess, we evaluate them? So anti-natalism about human beings would be that, for that human being, everything in sum total is worse than it is good. But anti-natalism about artificial intelligence could be, sure, I mean, they could be just basking in the glory of the universe after they've killed all of us. But it's like, from our perspective, we don't want to initiate that process. Not necessarily because, I mean, we can get into this with the consciousness aspect of it, but it's not necessarily that utility wouldn't be maximized. It's that we wouldn't be part of that utility maximization.
Yeah, and every utility calculation assumes some measurement for how we're measuring happiness and suffering, whose happiness and suffering we're measuring, whose we're not. So you're right. If we're only considering if we're considering the happiness and suffering of the AI system, then maybe it wouldn't matter. If it replicated itself and destroyed humanity and spread throughout the cosmos, then that would be more overall happiness, and we should be happy about that. But yeah, I also think it's plausible to say, well, for the sake of this calculation, let's just consider human happiness and suffering. That's even broader than we might use to calculate happiness and suffering. So if somebody's like a subjective hedonist, which just means I only care about my own happiness and suffering, then my own death is like an infinite loss. So I consider my own death to be just like the worst possible thing. And I don't care what happens after I die. If you're this subjective hedonist, you only care about your own pleasure and pain, and what happens after you die doesn't matter. But most people aren't like that. Most people care about the future of humanity, and they think of their own death as something that is sad, but not necessarily an infinite loss. It's just a very, very serious loss. On the other hand, I think most people think that the destruction of humanity, the permanent destruction of humanity, would be an infinite loss in some sense. It would just be the destruction of anything we care about, anything you could ever potentially care about. That would be the end of it. And what's weird about thinking about infinite losses is that you get into this Pascal's wager scenario where all of a sudden any possibility of an infinite loss also becomes an infinite risk, because a small probability times times an infinite loss is an infinitely bad risk. A small probability of an infinitely big reward is an infinitely potential payoff. And so there are some objections you could use to this reasoning, but in the article, I just sort of accept it. And I say, okay, well, let's accept Pascal's reasoning here and see where it leads us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because maybe we should be explicit for people who don't. I think most people have kind of like a lay intuition of what Pascal's wager is, but explicitly he says, we're at this kind of agnosticism point, and you can either believe in God or you cannot believe in God. Now, if you believe in God and God exists, then hooray, you get to go to heaven and bask in glory with him forever. And if he doesn't exist, then it's no issue because you're just dead anyway. Whereas if you don't believe in God and he does exist, it's infinite loss because you get tortured in hell forever, or reincarnated, or etc. But if you don't believe in God and there is no God, then it's only a finite gain because you're right about terrestrial things in this life. And so, yeah, I had a few notes about the objections to that, because so the first one, and this is one that really convinced me a lot when I was like a kid, kind of leaving religion. The psychological impossibility objection, where you can question, like, is it actually possible? Like, is this what we mean when we say belief? To kind of believe in some utility maximization based way that, like, I don't have any good reason to believe God exists, but because I'm going to bet on it, therefore I really do believe that it exists. And it seems like that's a great counter to Pascal's argument for God, but it doesn't seem to actually hold as much for the AI case, because if it is in fact possible, it is in fact possible. It's baked into the kind of decision tree in that case.
Agreed. Yeah. So Pascal's wager, you're right, has some classic objections to it. And that's one of the classic objections, which is just that if you pay me, or if you offer to pay me $1 million right now to believe that I have a third arm growing out of my chest, I'm just not going to be able to do it. I can't force myself to believe something contrary to evidence, which is an interesting sort of argument against free will in the realm of belief. I'm sort of forced or compelled to believe things that I have evidence for. I'm genuinely incapable of just believing some random thing, even if it would be really good for me.
Yeah.
This is a problem with happiness research too, is that there's a lot of happiness research suggesting that religious people may be happier than atheists, but it's not like I could just all of a sudden force myself to believe. Now, Pascal does have a response to this in his Pensées, where he writes about this, and he says, well, okay, I'll grant you that, but human beings are creatures of habit, and if we go to church and just go through the motions, then eventually you'll find yourself justifying it to yourself, and who knows, if you wind up believing just a little bit, then maybe that's better than nothing.
Yeah.
Now, I agree with you that this argument is not plausible for a lot of other reasons. There are these other classic objections, the many gods objection, which is that, well, let's assume that there are all these other gods that will punish you with infinite badness and reward you with infinite goodness for believing or not believing in them. Then which one do you pick? It seems like you should be indifferent. You should just flip a coin or roll a die to pick which of these gods to believe in. Even then, Pascal might say, well, that's still better than atheism. You might as well pick one. But I agree with you that the Pascal argument historically for believing in God is not that compelling. But in the case of AI, it might be compelling because you're right, it's not an argument to believe something. It's an argument about creating something. It's saying, in this case, maybe there's infinite risk in creating this thing and finite gains in creating it, and therefore we just shouldn't make it. I take it this is the kind of argument that anti-natalists about AI are giving. Who are some of these anti-natalists about AI? Nick Bostrom is the most famous one, although it's hard to pin him down. He's notoriously hard to pin down about his actual claims. He often will just say, well, I'm just giving these arguments. I'm not actually endorsing any of them. Sam Harris has advocated something like this. Elon Musk has, in some provocative tweets, suggested that general AI is more dangerous than nuclear weapons, that we should be really concerned about it. He was on a podcast with Lex Friedman where he was arguing for that as well. So I interpret these arguments to have sort of a Pascal-style reasoning. That was the first part of the article, is saying that I think they're using sort of Pascal-style reasoning, but if they're doing that, they're actually leaving something else out.
Yeah. And it seems to me that the infinite utilities critique where people say, like, Pascal, like, you're off your rocker, because how do we actually factor in? I mean, you pointed this out a little bit before, like, how do we actually do calculations with infinities? But I find, to be honest, I kind of find that the weakest objection, both in Pascal's argument for God and this Pascalian thinking about artificial intelligence, because it seems like, I mean, if it's like, if you want to expand it as far as you want, let's say it's not just human life, but it's all conscious life. Well, then, I mean, yeah, that does kind of get closer to infinity, like at least local infinity, like in our species or in our universe. So I find that objection to be a little bit moot in both cases. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, so I'll say, just personally, I don't care if non-intelligent life survives after humans.
Yeah.
Just, personally, I confess I only care about intelligent life. And if humanity winds up getting destroyed, but like the fungi survive, and I don't give a shit about the fungi.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter to me.
Yeah.
I think that the kinds of things that matter are human, or I should just say intelligent experiences, intelligent life. And if intelligent life gets destroyed, then I agree with you. That seems like what I would mean by an infinite loss. That just seems to me like equivalent to the destruction of the universe. You might as well just destroy the entire universe, because if intelligent life is not there, then nothing really matters to me. And again, you could object to that, but this is just how I'm getting the argument off the ground.
Yeah, I find that a very reasonable assumption to make. I mean, it's hard for me to locate any value in just a barren universe. Like, if there's just kind of rocks orbiting other rocks, there's, it's just like, well, where is the value there?
Yeah.
Would you, I guess, if I would phrase that not in terms of intelligence, but in terms of consciousness. But is that, so you said intelligent experiences. Is that just a different phrasing for the same thing?
Yeah, I don't want to get too hung up on that. I mean, we could argue about whether a being without consciousness can experience happiness and is valuable in some way or not. But I don't think that's too important.
Okay.
Say the destruction of intelligence and consciousness.
Okay.
let's be expansive.
Now I'm on board. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
One thing I did want to correct when you were talking about Pascal's wager, or not correct, but expand on, is that Pascal, when he's talking about agnosticism, he's willing to grant the atheist that it might be super unlikely that God exists. Like, let's just grant that there is a 99.999% chance that God does not exist. That's fine. And so he's only looking for some glimmer of possibility. If there's even a small fraction of a chance that God might exist, then that will still give you infinite potential payoffs for believing in him and infinite potential losses for not believing in him. And so when it comes to AI, we might say the same thing, which is no matter how likely or unlikely you think this thing is to destroy humanity, if there's even a small fraction of a possibility of that happening, then the infinite losses that would ensue are just so great that we should not create this thing. They would outweigh any finite gains that we can get from it.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Because, I mean, obviously, mathematically, the only way to erase an infinity would be to multiply it by a zero. So anything above that, as small a number as you want, it's still infinity.
Exactly.
So that vitiates. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
And that's what I was calling the anti-natalist argument. That's how I characterize that argument. But they argue that it's much more significant than a small fraction of a percentage. That, like Elon Musk suggested, that it might be even more dangerous than the risk posed by nuclear weapons. I don't know. I wanted to ask you, I like asking people about this.
Yeah.
because my intuitions are sort of shot on these issues. I don't even have any intuitions
Been in the
anymore.
field too long. Yeah.
I have
Yeah.
been, yeah. But on a scale of like, let's say 0 to 100, where 0 is you're not worried about it at all, and 100 is it's the thing you're most worried about. It's just like maximum worry. How worried are you about, let's say, I'll ask you a few existential threats. So let's say climate change, destroying humanity, nuclear weapons, destroying humanity, and general AI destroying humanity.
Okay, so I have a clarifying question first. So when you say worried, are you talking about intellectually worried or emotionally worried? Because I have a disturbing asymmetry between those two. Like I'm extremely intellectually worried, but I can't find myself like actually emotionally pulled by a lot of those things.
I agree. And in fact, I was being deliberately ambiguous there because you might say, well, when we get in a car, we should be a lot more worried than we are.
Yes,
right? There's a lot more of a risk in getting in a car than there is a risk in getting on a plane.
Yeah,
exactly. And yet I definitely feel more worried about getting on a plane than getting in a car.
Yeah.
So you're right. I was being ambiguous there. I guess I could leave it up to you to interpret how you want to scale those.
That's a good question. So it was climate change, nuclear warfare, or nuclear annihilation, and AI, right?
Yep.
So yeah, climate change. Intellectually, all three of them are above 50%. Those seem to be more likely a problem than not. I mean, sometimes like when I actually think about nuclear deterrence, I mean, like that really does actually ratchet the emotional concern way up. I listened to, have you ever heard Dan Carlin's podcasts?
Oh, yeah.
He had that one. It was just a short, well, I was gonna say short 5-hour one, but it like wasn't a series one. On the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I mean, like that actually scared the shit out of me. Yeah. And then, a couple months back to realize that someone like Trump actually had his hands on the nuclear football at one point, or at least had the potential. I mean, that does ratchet the emotional severity up for me. But yeah, so all of them are for sure over 50%. It would have to I like 80s or 90s for all of them, honestly. I mean, like climate change is just going to be, I mean, that's closer to 100%. That might be the highest in terms of, in my lifetime, perhaps, surely affecting something. Because with, nuclear deterrence, it's just that one's just that I see that as more of a coin flip or like a dice roll where it's like it either could go to hell or it could not. But climate change is like, it's actively going to hell unless we do something, which we've just shown no ability to do. And I actually wonder if that's very analogous to the AI situation, where it's like right now, it just seems like we are on the course to have a private company with no safeguards just develop this. And it actually seems to be much more on par with the climate change analogy than the nuclear deterrence analogy in that way. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, so I will. Sorry about that. I will come back to this later because this is actually going to be fuel for my argument later on. But the second half of my little article there, and it's just like 2 pages. So the second page of my 2 pages is basically saying, hey, there are a bunch of other serious existential threats that humanity faces too, besides AI. And so the second part of the argument is saying that if you are only worried about the existential threat from AI, you were sort of ignoring the existential threat from these other things and the possibility, which I take to be a real possibility, that we can only survive these sorts of threats with the help of some kind of super intelligent AI. So if that's the case, then there becomes this other branch on the decision tree where on the one branch, we create artificial intelligence that has some kind of infinite risk for destroying humanity. But if we don't create artificial intelligence, then there's also an infinite risk, namely that we can't survive the future without this kind of super intelligent being. And so I call in the paper those two different catastrophes. One of them is catastrophe alpha, and one is catastrophe beta. And if you accept the Pascal style reasoning, then what's weird about these is that they just cancel out. The infinite losses of creating AI, or the infinite risk of creating AI, is perfectly canceled out by the potential infinite loss of not creating AI. And then all we have to consider are the finite gains and losses that we would have from creating or not creating it after that.
Yeah. I had a question about the potential canceling out. It seemed to me, so I didn't want to object to the positive infinity and negative infinity aspect of those because they both seemed, well, I guess it's actually just two sides of the negative, because in one case it's AI that destroys us, in the other case it's AI that fails to save us. So we're being destroyed in either sense. But I was wondering if perhaps they actually might not cancel out if we assign or have good reason to assign a different likelihood to those cases being what actually does or would happen. So for instance, like I'm just thinking, if we do create AI and we solve the control problem, then it seems overwhelmingly likely that we will in fact use AI to solve all these problems because we've solved the control problem. But if we don't, then it's overwhelmingly likely that it does destroy us. But I'm just wondering if sort of like, I'm not a person who would have a good idea of the true numbers of percentages here, but if because it's almost like both the negative infinities are still there, but I wonder if a different likelihood that we get to either of those would create an asymmetry there. I don't know.
So the good thing about Pascal's reasoning is that if there's, let's say, a 70% chance that if we create AI, it destroys humanity, but there's a 30% chance that if we don't create AI, something else destroys humanity, then both of those expected values are actually equal. And I understand your intuition because it's my intuition too, that like a 30% chance of infinite losses is actually better than a 70% chance of infinite losses. And vice versa, that the 70% chance of destroying humanity is worse than the 30% chance. You might say, well, I'll go with the 30% chance of like climate change and nuclear weapons destroying humanity than the 70% chance of AI. But the weird thing about Pascal style reasoning is that if these are really infinite losses, then they are the same number. That 30% of negative infinity is the same as 70% of negative infinity. Now, I understand your objections here. Anytime you start doing calculations with infinities anywhere, things get really weird. So in mathematics, when you start doing infinite sums, you can get these sorts of weird results, like the sum of the natural numbers 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 and so on seems to equal negative 1/12 in some ways of formulating that by using like the Riemann zeta function. And it's like, well, how does that make sense? It doesn't seem to make sense. That's just one example where infinities seem to not make sense. But if Pascal's assumption is correct, that any probability of an infinite loss is an infinite risk, no matter how small or big, then this argument goes through. But if you just reject that assumption, then I completely concede that this argument doesn't work, and that maybe we should be more worried about AI than other global catastrophic threats.
And so on that sort of upshot of it, you from how I'm reading you seem to say that since these two possibilities cancel out, then the analysis then really does turn to the more kind of terrestrial considerations. I'm understanding you right there?
That's exactly right. So then you cancel out, in the article I have this little decision tree, and Basically, you cancel out infinite loss alpha and you cancel out infinite loss beta, and all you have left are either you have the status quo, humanity survives without AI's assistance, or you have these gains from AI, and I call them finite gains. And that just means AI helps solve all of humanity's problems, right? And so that's finite in the mathematician sense of just really, really, really great. That we can perhaps now survive the cosmos indefinitely. Maybe AI could help us figure out a way to defeat the second law of thermodynamics and somehow spread our intelligence throughout the universe. This is the ending of Isaac Asimov's short story, The Last Question, where human beings wind up being the sort of primordial spark that lights the universe on fire and spreads this intelligence everywhere. So I'm excited about that possibility. I like fantasizing and dreaming about it. The physicist David Deutsch has a book called The Beginning of Infinity, where he tries to argue for something like that. I'm certainly in no position to professionally evaluate that or not, but I like the idea of that. I would like for humanity and intelligence and consciousness to continue. And if it's a significant likelihood that we can't continue, that intelligence and consciousness cannot continue without AI, then it seems to me like it's just as much of a risk to not create AI than it is to create it.
Yeah, because it seems to me that it's at least conceivable that you could arrive at the same conclusion, even if you do allow for these sort of percentages of not only the outcomes, but the percentages of the arrows, for lack of a better term, in your decision tree. And it seems like maybe the most important arrow, in my opinion, might be on your diagram, the very bottom one, where it's what are the chances that we could survive without AI's assistance given our current state? Because if that percentage chance is low enough, then I suddenly shift from being rather risk averse to joining your optimistic train very quickly.
That's exactly why I asked you earlier what your evaluation of these non-AI catastrophic risks is, because if you think it's pretty high, I mean, if you're really worried about humans surviving, which I kind of am, I don't think about this very often. I have other stuff to do. I work on more narrow AI and problems that are being developed right now in the next 5 to 10 years of AI, discriminating and producing results that are unfair and wind up resulting in all sorts of death and destruction and deprivation of resources. So that's the stuff I mainly think about. But every now and then, while I'm lying awake at night at 3 a.m. and I can't sleep, I sometimes, worry about humanity's future long-term survival. And I am sometimes worried that we might not, with our human level intelligence, be capable of sticking it out for the long haul. So, as a species, we've been around for, 100,000 to 200,000 years-ish. Evolutionary biologists can, of course, give me more exact numbers. But when I think about what's the likelihood of us surviving for at least that long, at least as long as we've been around as a species, I get very worried. As you pointed out, just in the last 100 years, we've had some pretty close calls. Now, it could be there are some optimists like Steven Pinker who want to say, yes, that maybe we almost destroyed ourselves a few times in the 20th century there. Stanislav Petrov saved us and some other Russians who just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Like this, I forget his name, but there was a third commander on one of the Soviet subs in the Cuban Missile Crisis who, when they were about to launch, he was the only man who said, no, let's not launch. And so it's those moments where, I get worried about not just for nuclear weapons, but any other kind of technologies that might be developed in the next few thousand or 100,000 years that, like you pointed out, might just ignite the atmosphere or create a black hole or something like that. And so human beings, I sometimes get a little worried about. I get nervous about our intelligence. We're not that bright as a whole. There's a famous quote from Newton where he says, I just feel like a child playing in the beach with some pebbles looking out at the vast sea of knowledge. And, that's one of our best.
Yeah.
Not morally best. Newton was a terrible person, but he was certainly one of our brightest. And I sometimes think, well, in order to survive the cosmos, we might need to invent superintelligence.
Yeah. And it seems to me like, just being pessimistically realist, that like we just are going to go down the top part of the decision tree. Like, I find it almost inconceivable that we will actually decide to pull the brakes on this. I don't know, you probably have a better touch of the leading, minds in this field, but like, is there any real sense in which we could actually say no to developing AI?
So the usual argument about this is an analogy to biological and chemical weapons, where so far, at least, the international bans have been really effective. And a big reason for this might just be it's in the interest of big, wealthy nations to keep weapons expensive. And if you make them affordable to everyone, then there are some real dangers that emerge. And already drone technology is sort of crossing this threshold where it's becoming cheap and easily accessible. So there have been some recent wars in the last few years that have proved decisive because of drone tech. And there are some serious worries about where that's going to go. But at the level of artificial general intelligence, there are some arguments that make that analogy to chemical and biological weapons and just say, look, if the right people get behind it, then it could be an effective ban. If it's too expensive to make, if it just requires too many resources, and it might just wind up being a successful ban in some way. So I don't know if that's going to actually work out, or if in the future it's just going to become so easy to develop an AGI that any just bored CS undergrad in her basement could put together the right components to make it. I don't know if that's going to happen or not. I agree with you about your point about being cynical about humans. I just pointed out I'm a little bit disappointed with our intelligence. That also applies to our other personality and character traits as well. I'm not usually very trusting of the humans, and so I agree with you that it might wind up being an inevitability. But of course, the point of philosophy is not to talk about what is inevitable, unless you're Karl Marx. But it's about to say what we should and shouldn't do. And so even if it's inevitable, philosophers will say, well, here are some arguments why we shouldn't do it.
We can kick and scream the whole way there.
Exactly. At least we could say, I told you so. I mean, that's something.
The final moments as it's destroying the earth, I told you so. Right. That was, I remember someone had that style of objection to Pascal about it's like, you kind of have the near-death experience and you come back and there's nothing and you get to say, I told you so, or something like that. Yeah,
that's the frustrating thing about the afterlife, is that the people who believe in it and were right never get to show off. The people who wind up not believing it, I guess if they go to hell, well, maybe if the people in heaven can sort of shout down like, see, I told you so. I guess it's the opposite, isn't it? That the people, if there's no afterlife, then we don't get to, the ones who don't believe in the afterlife like me, I don't get to rub it in anybody's face afterwards and say, see, I told you so.
Which is a deep sadness.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know. It seems so disanalogous to, I don't know exactly. Maybe this was either Bostrom or someone who I picked this up from, but it's my understanding that we're actually not lacking in computational power. It's not that the hardware at this point is really the hang up. It's more about the software. And if that's true, and the cost of processing power continues to decrease by whoever's law that is, I can't remember.
Moore's law.
Yeah, that's right. It just seems like it's going to be analogous to if you could make a nuclear bomb by microwaving glass or something. Like, it'll just be too easy to do. And there's just, I mean, like you said, like a CS undergrad could just make, an AI in her basement. And I have very like deep skepticism that the part of the decision tree where we don't make it is actually a live option for us. So in I guess my more realist moments, then I do shift to your side and say, like, okay, well then how can we just maximize, the control problem working out for us and issues like that. But I was curious actually how, if at all, your view is looked at or altered or changed. If we think about, let's say that because I was thinking about the decision tree, and I was wondering if another area where you could critique the ideas of the infinities canceling out is the time before catastrophe alpha or beta. So if there was 1,000-year difference in the time that it took to reach either catastrophe, that does seem to create slightly more and less of a negative infinity there.
That's a really good point. And this actually gets to important questions about the purpose of life, the meaning of life in general, which is that, if it turns out that humanity is going to get destroyed in 1,000 years compared to 1,000,000 years, is that an interesting or important difference? Do I care about that? I'll admit that just personally, my own view is that I want humanity to survive and spread permanently throughout the cosmos. I have this view that life is only meaningful if it winds up producing some permanent change in the universe. And the second law of thermodynamics seems to be a serious problem for that, which is if there's no way to enact a long-lasting and permanent change in the universe, then life might be meaningless. And that's depressing for me. You could, of course, have a view that no, there's some kind of let's just call it limited or qualified amount of changes that you could make, where if you make some kind of large, almost permanent change, or that a very long-lasting change, let's call it, to the universe, and have intelligence and consciousness for 1,000 or 1,000,000 years, that would actually be very valuable. Then in that case, you're right, the calculations might change. I suppose that I'm coming at this from a peculiar perspective, or maybe not a peculiar perspective. I actually don't know. There hasn't been a lot of good psychology and survey work on people's views about the purpose of life and the future of humanity. There's been a little bit of work on this, but usually it's this sort of psychoanalytic work in the tradition of like Ernst Becker's The Denial of Death and so on, where it doesn't actually go out and do survey research and present people with scenarios like the one I was describing, where, imagine that there was an asteroid that's going to destroy humanity in 1,000 years versus 100 years. Do you care about the difference, even though you're not around for either one? I've just informally asked some friends of mine about this. I don't know, I could ask you about this. Would it matter to you if humanity were going to get destroyed 100 years after you die or 1,000,000 years after you die?
Oh, okay. So after because I was going to say, I have like this naive hope that I might be alive in 100 years still, given like advances in medical technology.
Sure. Let's say 100 years after
I die. I do. So I do kind of have a difference there. And it's not a robust one, but it's sort of like, so after, I guess kind of my views have been affected by Thomas Nagel's essay, The Absurd, about this. And it's like, I do, because, he asks these like wonderful rhetorical questions, like, people often say like life is meaningless because X, and he, sometimes they're we're so small, like the universe is so vast, how could we matter? And he asked like, well, okay, if we were just like 2/3 the size of the universe, like would we suddenly have meaning there? It's like, obviously not. And people say that we only live like 80 years. And if he's like, well, if you could live 800 years, would you have objective meaning? They'd be like, well, no, it's like you still die. And so like, the kind of upshot for me, at least from that essay, is that there is no objective meaning. There's really only local meaning. And once I die, any sense of, so objective meaning is not present either when I'm alive or when I'm dead. It's just an illusion when I'm alive. But local meaning is, I believe, something that's robustly there when I'm alive, but it's not when I'm dead. Clearly, because I'm dead. So if life ends 100 years after I'm dead versus 1,000, I almost have this kind of, it's probably very naive, but sense in which like I can affect the next 100 years more than I can affect the next 1,000 years. And so then it percolates back and almost makes my life more meaningful now. But of course, there's paradoxes in that too, because if I can make a change, it has the potential to affect more people over 1,000 years if it's a big enough change than 100 years. So I think there's a lot of intuitions that when you compare them are very poorly aligned in this field.
Yeah, I agree. It's sort of like the difference between getting on a plane and getting in a car, where it feels like it is a difference, even though it really shouldn't be. Or rather, it feels, at least to me and a lot of people, when I get on a plane, like that's more risky, when in fact it's the opposite. So here you might say that, well, if the entire population of intelligent and conscious beings are going to be destroyed at some point in the future, excuse me, then who cares when it's going to happen? And this is a very what you might call telic view of the purpose of life, where life is meaningful and human activity, intelligent activity, is meaningful because of what it brings about, because there's some kind of end state that it creates. And you're right, this is a less popular view now than it used to be in the past. But it's one I admit I still find personally very plausible. I like to ask friends of mine and annoy them at dinner parties, when we used to have dinner parties, about, if you knew that an asteroid was going to destroy all of humanity in the next, let's say, 5 years versus the next, 20 years or something, would you change things about your life? Would you do things differently? And it seems like people would, but I'm not sure if that makes sense. I'm not sure if that's irrational yet.
Yeah. It seems clearly less rational when you make it a small difference like that. 5 versus 20 is like that. That's still just, 5 years and 20 years can be so similar. Because it seems obvious that like if I was going to die in a week versus I was going to die in 40 years, then there is some way in which it's like perfectly reasonable for me to just kind of go hog wild for the next week or whatever, But like, so I don't know, when you make it 5 versus 20, I guess maybe there's like an underlying skepticism that you should live in a way how could you live in a way that's sustainable for 5 years but not for 20? It's like I feel like there's some creeping intuition about that.
Yeah, so you're saying, when you say hog wild, I assume you mean kind of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, like hedonism.
Yeah, go AC/DC style. Yeah.
Right, and so you're saying the question is, if you're let's say a long-term hedonist, which means that I just want to get as much of it in as I can before I die, then the question is, why do we even care about the future of humanity? Because I'm not going to be around to experience it. It's not something that I will be conscious of. Why do I care about the happiness of other people? This is a foundational question in ethics, but also in questions about the purpose of life. I know I've gotten us onto sort of a weird tangent, but
yeah, no, it's a good one. Yeah,
I think it's important for thinking about these sorts of existential threats, because what we're doing is we are essentially saying, let's assume that AI can help us to, and by us, I mean intelligent conscious beings. AI can help intelligent conscious beings spread throughout the cosmos and survive, let's say, indefinitely. Somehow defeat the second law and just completely create all of every single point in space-time into an intelligent conscious entity. If this is possible, then it seems to me like this is a really, really awesome thing. And when we are talking about the creation of AI, superintelligence, then we should be considering these kinds of benefits that we might get, and not just the very, very short-term ones, like, oh, they'll be able to solve political polarization in the United States. Well, that's great. I want the Trump signs taken down because it's 2021.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I would also like all the space-time points in the universe to be conscious and intelligent and their own unique beings who each coordinate with each other in interesting networked ways. I'm just spitballing here.
Yeah.
But this is something that I would love to happen, and I think it might only be possible with super intelligent AI.
Now that's an interesting way to argue for it, because it really does. It sort of it puts at least on par, maybe not the exact same par, but it puts them in the same ballpark. Well, we could die from not solving the alignment problem in 100 years, but we're all going to die anyway. Like, we know we're going to die anyway, no matter what. But there's like this, it's an outside chance, but it's still a chance that we do create literally infinite existence. Which I feel like that would be turning the dial on local meaning as high as you can go. I don't think it would give some objective meaning still in the senses that Nagel kind of puts forth, but to deny that there's a difference between the dial being where it's at and being cranked up to 10 on the local, like that there's clearly a difference there.
Yeah, and in fact, I would say that once you turn the entire universe into something meaningful, then that would be as close to objective meaning as I would ever want to define. I mean, to me, that just means that objective reality is itself a sort of conscious, intelligent creature. Then we get to sort of, this is just like Spinoza's God. It is the universe, which is this kind of perfect being. And again, I know all of this sounds sort of wacky and silly, which is why, I don't usually write about it even as a philosopher, you have to stay reasonable.
It's too continental.
Exactly. You can't, well, even the continental folks aren't going to talk about like the future of, intelligent life in the cosmos too much. I feel like you just sound like a crazy person, even though this is stuff that I think all of us to some extent hope for. I want intelligence and consciousness to survive forever, but it sounds very strange to talk about it. And that's why there's a sort of professional pressure to, let's keep it sensible, keep it normal.
Which is, it's kind of, it's a little absurd when you think about, all of this detail going into the individual fluctuations in any particular consciousness. But when we talk about, on a grand scheme, preserving consciousness itself, that seems a little hoity-toity. But it's like, but if we care about like the individual instance of consciousness in one person, or, when you think about it for a couple of minutes, it seems like, well, no, it's like really reasonable questions to be asking.
Yeah, and I mean, this is, like I pointed out, is things we that are inherent in our practices. So why do I have children? I mean, what's the point? It's not making me happier, and I'll tell them that to their faces. That children do not make you happier. And even if they do, you can pose the counterfactual question, which is, would you still have them even if they made you miserable? And almost everybody who was already going to have children will say yes. Clearly, being happy is not part of the causal reasoning that is prompting you to have them. So then why are we having them at all? And most people just don't have a good answer to that question.
Yeah.
Which is why I sort of included the jab about anti-natalism there when talking about opposition to creating AI. When you think about having children, it's this weird sense of, I want to live forever, or I want a part of me to continue. Maybe not my memories and my personal identity, but something about intelligence and consciousness and my actions and the things that I do in my life will have some impact on the future of humanity. And it's strange to think about, but that is why most people have children, I conjecture.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like it really surprised me that people actually do answer yes. Like if granted that having kids would make you, like, my answer is just no there. Like if it and I guess I'm weird for saying that, but like my answer is just simply no. Like
maybe I'm weird.
Maybe. I think we're probably both in different ways, but
as a philosopher, what I can say is that we're just outlining two different positions here in the space, which is great. So you can outline, here's the hedonist position, or the sort of long-term hedonist position, who says, I'm just doing these things to be happy and to experience happiness, and I care about other people's happiness as well, and I want to maximize the total amount of happiness that exists. But I am outlining a more, let's call it old-fashioned, you might even call it ancient position that says that it's not about, I don't care about my own happiness or the happiness of others. I care about making some permanent changes in the world that will, in some sense, last forever.
Yeah, in which, Benatar calls you a monster for doing so.
Yeah, Benatar is not a fan of the fact that I have created not just one, but two people.
No. Actually, another tangent I wanted to ask you about. Do you have a view about the, I guess, source or the hard problem of consciousness, and does that affect your views on AI?
That is a difficult question. I do not have an official position about the hard problem of consciousness. Most of my research allows me to conveniently sidestep these problems because I just have to say something like, okay, well, if we create either a narrow AI or general AI, what are the risks and the benefits to these things? What kinds of harms can they do? And I don't usually have to worry too much about the harms or the benefits to the AI system itself. But there are some of my colleagues who do think about this problem, about the question of, if you create an artificial general intelligence, does it begin to have some kind of value? At some point, should you consider its own pleasures and pains when making these calculations? This is also related to the question of having children. When you talk about having children, it's strange to say, well, I'm doing it for the sake of the child. Just about nobody says that because these people don't actually exist yet. But then once they exist in some sense, then all of a sudden you have to consider their value and their interests in some way. But the unsatisfying short answer to your question is, I don't have an official position about that. Personally, my view is that if you create a machine that is complicated enough that it will have consciousness in some way, and here complicated, again, I have no idea what that means. My favorite theory of consciousness is Giulia Tononi's information processing theory, is integrated information theory. That's my favorite, but that's just a personal favorite. I think that Tononi has done some really, really great work with trying to empirically validate his hypothesis about consciousness. It's almost, I think, the only game in town when it comes to a scientifically rigorous theory of consciousness. That's not the only reason why I like it. I think, generally speaking, that integrated networks are a really robust way of thinking about relationships and consciousness and identity
Yeah.
as well. So that's my perhaps unsatisfying answer, which is I think that I'm a materialist about consciousness, unlike, say, David Chalmers. I believe that if you create a system that has enough of this value that Tononi calls phi, that it will be conscious. But I don't think you need to have a conscious AI system in order to worry about the things it's going to do and the benefits that it could have for us.
Yeah, it certainly would complicate perhaps especially from an expected utility perspective, but from our own self-interest perspective, it really doesn't change much. Maybe it could empathize with our pain or something like that and fail to destroy us, take pity on us or something. But it could, to be fair, it could come to that conclusion whether it was conscious or not.
Yeah, so I will say I am a sort of a moral realist, which sometimes feels unpopular, but there's this Phil Papers survey that shows that like 56% of professional philosophers are moral realists.
Really? I thought it would be lower.
Yeah, it's surprising. There's also some work from psychologists philosophers and psychologists like Goodwin and Darley and Nichols that tries to argue that most people are intuitively moral realists. But that's not, of course, an argument. That's just some psychology.
Sure.
But I think that there's good reason to believe that a super intelligent being actually would discover the value of intelligent and conscious beings and respect us and care about us. So this is a separate issue. This is getting beyond my little Pascal's AI wager article. This is actually another paper I've just written, and I don't want to get too deep into the details about it. But I suspect that if there are objectively real moral facts, that you would expect a super intelligent being to be very good at identifying those facts and reasoning about them. And therefore, we might have less to worry about in the other branch that I put on the diagram of AI destroying humans if it turns out that moral realism is true.
Interesting. I guess as a I don't want to force you to talk about a paper that's still secret yet, but as an assumption maybe on that side is that if it were not conscious, it would have to be able to discover the principles that ground the moral realism non-experientially. So for instance, if you're a moral realist of some sort of a utilitarian bend, it's conceivable at least that arriving at that conclusion would be dependent on the agent thinking about that, to itself experience the differences between pleasure and pain, and then be able to apply that to what is likely other conscious creatures.
Yeah, so I don't want to say that an AI system would need to actually believe or think or care about these moral claims, just as long as it acts according to them. So for instance, if an artificial agent, and now I'm calling it an artificial moral agent because it's discovered the moral facts, if it acts respectfully towards other humans, then to me, that is at least minimally a win. Now, of course, there are going to be, for instance, our good friend Immanuel Kant is going to say, well, if it doesn't actually believe those things that it's acting on, then it is not an agent worthy of our mutual respect in some way. And that's fine. I'm not going to get too worried about that. As long as, for instance, this artificial moral agent is capable of identifying facts that cause it to respect and care about humans in all the way that we respect and care about each other. And it might even be better than us at doing so.
It could easily
be the fun thing.
Yeah,
there's an article in a book called Robot Ethics 2.0, edited by Pat Lynn and some other people, where I think it's Peterson argues that a super intelligence might also be super ethical, on the grounds that if it were super intelligent, it would be very, very good at discovering facts about respecting others and creating more overall happiness.
You mentioned Sam Harris as one of the kind of like people in the public sphere talking about this. He made one point that I really liked a lot, which is, this would force us to clarify what ethics or what, systems of ethics we respect and which ones we don't. It's not no one's going to be a moral relativist when we're programming the AI.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's, I think, a great benefit to robot ethics and AI ethics is that it actually forces ethicists to be more specific about what we mean by things like respect and consent and benefit, and even things that are well worked out in the law, like discrimination. I mean, there's been decades of discrimination law, but only recently it's emerged that, for instance, an automated system that is evaluating credit scores cannot actually, it can exclude facts about your gender or your race, but it can use other features that are correlated with those in ways that wind up being producing outcomes that are disparate. And so the question is, okay, is this a case of discrimination or not? And these are new kinds of questions that actually force us to get clear about what we mean by things like discrimination and respect and dignity, which I think is great. Because we no longer can sort of wave our hands and ambiguously say, well, you have to be a person of good character who just has all the virtues. You have to be wise and temperate and just and beneficent and non-maleficent. And it's like, okay, what does that mean? Program that into a machine. I have to know how to do it because I'm making this machine right now, and the machine is going to be driving around on the street, and I have to know what it's going to do.
Yeah, it really does. It does shift us from, which is not to say that something like, Aristotelian virtue ethics isn't valuable to humans, but really, I'm a fan of it.
I was joking. I saw you had Patrick Lee Miller on the show, and I'm good friends with Patrick.
Okay. So. Yeah, we discussed a few Black Mirror episodes that were interesting.
Yeah, I just tease him and others about virtue ethics. I think it is actually a very valuable theory, but I also think it has serious problems with ambiguity of that sort.
Where, for sure.
If you try to clarify, okay, what is wisdom and temperance and beneficence? You get
a little circular. Yeah. No, for sure. But yeah, no, I share your excitement about the clarifying nature of actually developing these systems, because we're not just going to be able to allow anything at that point. I'm realizing also, though, that we're closing in on your hard stop. So I wanted to give you the opportunity just to plug, anything that you're doing. Where can people find your work, get in contact with you, et cetera? Yeah,
so I am, let's see, where can people find me? Well, they could always email me. I'm an academic philosopher. I get a ton of emails, and I try to respond to them. Plugging things. I don't know. I have some articles in the works. I have some projects going on, but God, I really feel like I should be more good at self-promotion at this point.
I will include links to things like your website, for instance.
Yeah, you could look at DerekLeben.com, and that's going to have updates on all of my media appearances and articles and events, anything that's going on. I'll put it up there.
Awesome. Derek, stay on the line, but thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Okay, well, I hope that you found that episode as interesting as I did. Like I said, it was very fun to talk with Professor Leben, and if you want to find out more about his work, I will leave links to both the article that we reference and all of his other work in the description below. If you want to support this show, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Jordan Myers. You can share this show on Twitter or on social media. You can rate it on Apple Podcasts. You can like this video on YouTube or on your podcast player, or subscribe on either of those things. You can discuss it on your own show and link back to this one. And you can also connect me with or recommend guests or topics to cover on the show. You can get in contact with me at platoscavepodcast@gmail.com or on Twitter at Jordan_C_Myers. And as always, thank you for listening, and keep struggling to escape the cave.